Hello and welcome back to Catching Up on Capitol Hill, a series in which we discuss the latest in tax legislation and in tax policy. I'm your host, John Gimigliano. There's a saying here in Washington, perhaps overused, that people are policy. That means, of course, that policy choices, they're not made in a vacuum. They're made by people, people with preferences and people with agendas that shape those policy choices. But there's actually a corollary to the people or policy rule that gets a lot less attention. And that is that process is policy also. Now, I know that does not sound very exciting, but in some ways, it's even more true than the people or policy rule because the process of enacting legislation and the rules that govern that process, they often limit the universe of policy choices that Congress and policymakers generally can make. For example, do you think that in 2017, Republicans, after years of fighting for tax reform, thought that it was a good idea to sunset most of those tax changes after just 8 years? No, of course they didn't. But they had very little choice because the process of enactment forced them to sunset those rules. And so here we are. Now, when we last left you, we were discussing whether, in addressing the looming $4 trillion tax cliff of 2025, Congress would pursue a one bill or a two bill strategy. Okay, I'm happy to inform you, well, maybe not happy, but the truth is that debate still goes on between Capitol Hill Republicans. So if you haven't listened to that episode, well, now's your chance. It's all still valid. But if you recall, one of the realities driving that debate, the one bill, two bill question, is the fact that Republicans will be bound by the arcane rules of budget reconciliation. Reconciliation, of course, is that process whereby a controlling party can pass legislation in the Senate with a simple majority vote rather than the regular process supermajority of 60 votes. This is, of course, how Republicans approved the TCJA itself back in 2017. But it's, of course, also how Democrats moved the Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan Act in the last Congress. This reconciliation rule, this has become how business gets done in Washington on big, complex legislation. So because of this, it's worth investing an episode on the rules of reconciliation themselves because we are going to be hearing about this all year long. So to help us unpack these rules, and not for theoretical reasons, but to determine how those rules might dictate what is in or out of the bill, when the bill might happen, or even whether the bill might happen, we are joined by our friends Jen Acuna and Dan Winnick. Okay, Dan, I have a question for you. Before we even talk about reconciliation, are we absolutely sure, confident, that this bill, this tax extenders bill, the tax cliff, whatever it is we're going to call it, they're going to do this year, is going to be a Republican-only bill? It cannot get 60 votes with Democratic support, keeping in mind, of course, that President Biden, candidate Harris talked about extending some of these provisions. So are we confident that this thing is not going to get 60 votes under regular order in the Senate?
Nothing is certain, but congressional leadership so far has indicated they intend to pursue a budget reconciliation bill to extend the TCJA. TCJA was itself passed through reconciliation. If there were going to be a bipartisan bill, Democrats would likely demand certain changes to the bill or their own policies to leave their imprint on it. Doing the bill on a party line basis gives Republicans the opportunity to extend their policies without making any concessions to Democrats. Of course, things could change, and it's possible there could be a short-term extension of TCJA on a bipartisan basis, especially if there's some unexpected event, perhaps toward the end of the year. But the way things look today, I think we expect a reconciliation bill.
When people say something, we should believe them. Republicans have been very clear that they intend to do this via budget reconciliation, even if maybe there was some kind of deal to be had on a bipartisan basis. I think you're right. And look, we still remember the Smith-Wyden bill on different extenders, the 174 bonus depreciation, 163J, the child tax credit, that was done on bipartisan basis last year. But fair to say, Dan, that was then, this is now, circumstances have changed.
Well, circumstances have changed because now Republicans have a trifecta, and it was a different conversation when we had divided government.
The one caveat, and I think that's generally true, that's the number one goal. But I do think that the exit ramp, if Republicans are not able to reach consensus, remember they have razor thin majorities, if they're not able to reach consensus and there's a lot of political pressure mounting to pass an extension of the individual piece in particular that kicks in for taxable years beginning after this year, then you could potentially see a desire to move a bipartisan bill, depending on the circumstances. Clearly not the top choice when you have a trifecta.
Yeah, that is not plan A, but it's true. And we've actually even heard a little bit of those rumblings coming from the House side in particular, that for the less eager Republicans to vote for a tax bill to say, we can do this with or without you. We can do it with Democrats, although it's hard to see how that would go because both the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader, both Republicans would have to agree to do a bipartisan bill. And maybe if they're up against it in December, they would absolutely be pressured into that. But as you say, Jen, a lot of things would have to go wrong before we got to that point. Okay. All right, so let's just assume for the moment we're working within budget reconciliation because there aren't not 60 votes in the Senate. We're going to have to pass this with a bare majority of 51, including possibly 50 in the Senate with Vice President Vance casting the tie-breaking vote. So if we assume that, Jen, let me ask a question. Look, you lived through a reconciliation bill, as Dan said, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and the rules of reconciliation are incredibly Byzantine and complex and opaque. So let me just ask you a pretty straightforward question, because I think this is the question people want to know. What does reconciliation mean for the bill? So what specific things can we think about how using budget reconciliation would shape a tax bill in terms of content, timing, probability, et cetera? Go ahead.
The biggest influence that the reconciliation process has on a bill as a general matter, and of course, there's all sorts of influences that we'll talk about, but I found the most impactful difference is this keen eye on the budget. It's a budgetary measure. You have a specific number that has to be targeted. You cannot go over your budget. So it really requires a lot of internal discipline within the contours of a bill. Usually when you put together a bill through a regular order or a bipartisan bill, if it gets more expensive, it gets more expensive. As long as you have the votes, not a big deal. Not the case in reconciliation. Once that reconciliation instruction has been passed and you have dollars and cents, you have that budget set, it is set in stone. Your bill must comply with that number. I mean, it's a constraint, but it's also a virtue. It's a constraint because you can't go over your budget, but it's also a virtue because members really have to prioritize issues that they would have been happy to tackle in the bill. They have to prioritize it based on the budget.
The rules of budget reconciliation, in particular the budgetary constraints, ruthless taskmaster, because it's keeping you on task, but also not allowing you to stray off into other items. Fair point. All right, Dan, you worked on Build Back Better. That was also intended to be a reconciliation bill, so you've lived these rules. What other items do you think, because of budget reconciliation, could shape the way this bill looks?
Another feature of budget reconciliation is that the budget window or the period over which the budget resolution applies, it's normally a 10-year period, although that's a convention rather than a rule of law, but it's one that has operated for many years. That 10-year budgetary window, once you go past it, you can't increase the deficit in any year. And so we see a lot of temporary provisions in a budget reconciliation bill. I worked when I was on the House on 2 budget reconciliation matters, and both of them were full of temporary provisions. And we see a lot of temporary provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act as well. And that's really why we're faced with the tax cliff today. No matter what approach is taken, if it's a reconciliation bill, you'll see a lot of temporary provisions.
The tax cliff of 2025 will be the tax cliff again of some future date. Is that what we're getting at?
Yes, and I'm afraid that since at least I've been watching this world, tax cliffs have only proliferated. We always seem to have more expiring provisions, not fewer. And so it's likely that there will be some future tax cliff. And to the extent it's hard to reach a resolution on what priorities members want to include within the budget they set for themselves, you tend to see shorter policy. So one compromise you can make is just having the policy last for fewer years and hoping that a future Congress will be under pressure not to revert back to prior law. And so one possible approach that Congress could take would be shorter extensions, so we could see a cliff maybe not in another 7 years, but in 4 or 5 years.
Because I think the official position is make the TCJA items and expiring items permanent. Sounds like that is on a collision course with the reality of budget reconciliation. Is that what we're saying?
I think so.
I think that's a reasonable assumption. Jen, let me ask you a question about what Dan just said. That doesn't necessarily mean you can never make anything permanent in a reconciliation bill, right?
You absolutely can make permanent policy. To cite an example from the TCJA, the corporate rate reduction was permanent. The tricky part is that when you do commit to permanent policy in a reconciliation bill, it has to be fully offset outside of that 10-year budgetary window that Dan mentioned. So if you have permanent policy, you have to pay for it. Even if you have a generous deficit instruction outside of the 10-year window, it has to be completely offset 100%.
Tax cuts require matching forever tax increases or in some way offsets to make something permanent. Got it. Okay, what's another example of how the rules of budget reconciliation could shape this bill?
I tend to think in terms of timing. We usually think of and this, we're hearing this, right? We think about the negotiating a tax bill, the amount of time that it takes to negotiate a tax bill. Reconciliation doubles that time, where a bill could have potentially been negotiated if you didn't have to worry about reconciliation pretty quickly. It requires two steps. First, you have to negotiate the total deficit amount. Like I mentioned, this number really drives what can be included in a bill. That's a tense negotiation. And that's before you even get into round two, when you start negotiating the tax policies, the actual policy provisions, and the revenue implications of those provisions in the actual bill. So timing is certainly a way that significantly impacted by the budget reconciliation rules.
Yeah, I remember the budget reconciliation bill I worked on, and I worked in the House, but we were trying to help the Senate comply, and we're trying to meet our budget marks and sending revenue estimates out to the estimators at joint tax. And I remember option A, nope, that didn't work. Option B, option C, and they kept sending revenue estimates back. I think the one that finally became law was option double J. Right, we went all the way through the alphabet and then back around to double A and to double J. We finally got it right. So, first of all, kudos to the Joint Committee of Taxation being patient with all those revenue estimates, but boy, did it take a lot of time. Good point, Jen. All right, Dan, what else?
Well, another feature of budget reconciliation is that you can't include provisions that have a merely incidental budgetary effect. So it's limited to taxing and spending provisions. So there are a lot of policy priorities that members might have that can't make it into the bill. And that's one of the reasons that we focus so heavily on tax policy in budget reconciliation, because it's generally one of the parts of the law that can be addressed through reconciliation, but there's a lot more flexibility to address in terms of subject matter outside of budget reconciliation.
So you can't do everything in budget reconciliation because it's right there in the name, budget. So only budgetary items can fit in there. So anything that does not have a revenue effect or is not budgetary in nature. Am I remembering correctly, Dan? It was either during the American Rescue Plan Act or during Build Back Better. One of the hotly debated questions is whether or not a minimum wage increase could be inserted into budget reconciliation. I think the conclusion ultimately was no, because simply having a federal minimum wage, it may have incidental revenue effects, but not direct. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, that's right. This came up a few times in what ultimately became the Inflation Reduction Act. And during the American Rescue Plan, there was a desire to raise the minimum wage through budget reconciliation that was ruled not possible. Another where the point of order actually was voted on the Senate floor was the price of insulin, whether a budget reconciliation bill could cap the price of insulin for private health insurance plans, and that was not possible through budget reconciliation. And so those are just two recent examples of the parliamentarian finding that provisions did not have a budgetary effect. You can also have issues where provision has a very small budgetary effect, but it's really incidental to the overall provision, and that also is not permissible in reconciliation.
Got it. Dan, let me ask you another question because Jen talked about timing, I think, in the context of, boy, it takes time. It is so complex, so many iterations, and therefore it takes time. Let me ask a slightly different question on timing. So if this is budgetary and linked to budgets and fiscal years, talk about how that also sets up timing windows and deadlines for budget reconciliation.
The federal government's budget runs from October 1st to September 30th of the following year. And that means that a Congress has within it 3 fiscal years. There's the current fiscal year that started last October 1st. Then there's the one that starts October 1st of this year. And finally, the one that starts right before the midterm elections. So To use that first budget reconciliation measure, the bill needs to pass the Senate by September 30th of this year. And so for that first budget reconciliation measure, the congressional leadership has to be thinking how they're going to fit it in, given the timing of the August recess and the other obligations on the congressional calendar. The next budget reconciliation bill, in some ways, for budget year, provides them the most flexibility because the entire year is within this Congress. And so that one, if they want to do this bill at the end of the year to occur right before the TCJA provisions expire, that would likely be the budget resolution for fiscal year 2026, the year that starts October 1st, 2025. Now, there's been a little bit of talk in the Senate about having three reconciliation measures, but this has never succeeded before. And part of the reason is you'd have to do that last measure probably pretty close to the midterm elections. And it's just hard to get a really big bill through right before the election or in the lame duck period. And so it would certainly be a very risky strategy to try to have the biggest bill be in a third reconciliation package for that fiscal year that doesn't start until October 1st, 2026. That said, it's possible to do a bill earlier for that later fiscal year. It just couldn't have policies going into effect before that next fiscal year. So it is something they could try over the summer. But I think what we expect is that they're looking at this question of whether they do one bill or two bills. And that's been the core of the debate.
If you listen to our last episode, that was our topic. What's this whole thing about one bill, two bills? So we sort of hinted at it, but you nailed it in greater detail, Dan, that you get really one budget reconciliation per federal fiscal year. And budget reconciliation is limited by that. And it does set up these deadlines by which you must complete them. So, okay. All right. Last question for you, Jen. I get this question a lot. Maybe you do too. Is budget reconciliation really a good thing, right? Because what you end up getting is one party jams their policy through, and then the other party jams their policy through, and we're getting some of this policy whiplash. And wouldn't it be better if we did bipartisan bills to create better stability? Now, looking back on 2017, big picture, is budget reconciliation a good thing, or is it not a good thing?
First of all, I have a very biased opinion. I was asking about a bill that I spent like 7 years drafting, 7 years of my life. I think that budget reconciliation is actually a very good thing. Actually, for many of the reasons that we stated, I mean, I think it requires more fiscal discipline within the contours of the bill. Even though they are single party bills, you do see a lot of bipartisan product that end up in reconciliation bills because usually if it has bipartisan support, it definitely has single party support as well. So it's a faster way to get policies over the finish line. And the one piece that jumps out in terms of the TCJA is that for many years, there was bipartisan support on reducing the corporate rate. There wasn't agreement with respect to the rate. There was some bipartisanship with respect to 25%, but this was the vehicle that allowed that to happen. It happened to be a reconciliation bill. And I do think that the fiscal discipline that reconciliation requires can be good. Oftentimes you see these bipartisan bills and they have these big blowout budgets. Not necessarily the case. There's no hiding the size of the bill or the cost of the bill when it comes to reconciliation. It's a very transparent process.
It's a really interesting alternate history question. If budget reconciliation did not exist, what would the corporate rate be today? Is a reasonable chance it's still 35. You might think the 21 is too low, but I think most people agree 35 was too high. So it's an interesting question. And as you say, there are bipartisan measures. Even though, for example, Democrats did not vote for TCJA, there were some things in there that they say, yeah, in a different context, I would have voted for that. So it's a very valid point. Dan, last word. Do you agree with that, or do you wish budget reconciliation would just go away for good?
I think that you need some outlet for the majority party to enact its policy. And so I think if we didn't have budget reconciliation, there would be some other vehicle to circumvent the filibuster on these fiscal policy questions. Do the precise contours of budget reconciliation make sense? Probably not. They've evolved over time and are kind of a little bit random. But I think the point that Jen makes about the attention to budgetary impact and ultimately the need to have long run budget neutrality, that is, after the budget window, is an important feature. And I think it's important to note that provisions of budget reconciliation bills like the Affordable Care Act and now TCJA have survived the other party being in power. So it is possible that ones that are passed in budget reconciliation can generally be undone through budget reconciliation, but that hasn't been the pattern. And so maybe it has been one pathway for allowing some policy innovation that we wouldn't otherwise see.
Well said, Dan. Well, on that note, let's conclude. Great conversation today. Dan, Jen, thank you. In closing, I just wanted to reemphasize something that Dan said that I thought was really an excellent point. Budget reconciliation has gotten a lot of criticism over the years as being anti-democratic, or as being an end run around the filibuster rules of the Senate, or as even being an enabler of budget-busting bills. Those things might all be true, and I suppose it depends on your perspective and maybe even which bill we are talking about. But consider the possibility that, for all its flaws, reconciliation is actually a net good. Because, as Dan said, if nothing else, it provides a narrow safety valve for policy priorities. And that safety valve has helped keep the filibuster, the general rule requiring a supermajority vote in the Senate, has helped keep that rule alive. Because the supermajority rule of the Senate serves as one of the very best mechanisms we have to develop bipartisan laws. And we know that bipartisan laws are generally more popular, have longer durability, and therefore longer policy stability. So consider, if reconciliation didn't exist and, for example, the Affordable Care Act, which was passed under reconciliation, had never been enacted, would Democrats still be content to pursue healthcare reform maybe someday? Or, on the other hand, would the pressure to end the filibuster have become so great that they would have ended the filibuster to achieve that policy goal? Likewise, consider whether, if reconciliation did not exist and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was never enacted, would Republicans still be content to hope for tax reform someday? Or, again, would the pressure to have ended the filibuster become so great that Republicans would have done so to finally achieve tax reform? So yes, reconciliation, it's a flawed process, but it has served its limited purpose, and it appears it will again this year. With that, thanks again for tuning in to Catching Up on Capitol Hill. Take care. I hope to see you soon, and we'll be back next week with our next episode.